Welcome back to the second day of the Remote Work Conference. We are delighted to have you. We're going to continue with the same format as we had before of presentations that are about 20 minutes long and then questions and answers after that. We are delighted to start off our first session, which is on gender, with Has the Rise of Work from Home Reduced the Motherhood Penalty in the Labor Market, with one of our organizers, Emma Harrington.
Okay, great. We're so excited to have this on the program. I'm Emma Harrington. I'm at the University of Virginia, and this is joint work with Matt Kahn, who's at USC. So we start with the observation that when women become mothers, they often leave the labor force. This is one of the biggest drivers of differences in labor force participation by gender. Women and men without children are pretty equally likely to be working, but mothers are less likely to be working than fathers. And this is a particularly important driver of gender gaps in highly paid careers. Traditionally, when people have thought about what would make an occupation family friendly, they thought about flexibility over when to work and, to some extent, stability over when to work, that people could work during normal business hours. We're asking whether flexibility over where people could work could also reduce motherhood penalties in the labor market, especially in highly paid careers that might have more trouble offering people stability and an assurance that they could really only work during normal business hours. And this is particularly relevant when we think about changes in technology that have made remote work particularly more feasible in certain computer-oriented occupations. So here, memory's gotten cheaper during this period, so now we can lug around these small PCs that are as powerful as mainframe computers used to be, and then also internet's gotten a lot faster, and so you'd think that that would also make working at home much more of a good substitute for working in the office. And so in this paper, we're going to be asking whether work from home reduces motherhood penalties in the labor market, and we're going to be using changes in technology before the pandemic that led to faster increases in work from home for people with certain college degrees relative to those with other college degrees. And we're going to find that changes in work from home in college degrees in the decade before the pandemic were strongly predictive of changes in mothers' employment relative to that of other women. And so given that we see that it seems that remote work is particularly valuable for mothers, this raises the question of why there weren't more mothers working from home before the pandemic. We developed this signaling theory of mothers' choices to work from home, where we argue that before the pandemic, choosing to work from home may have signaled low labor market attachment and reduced firms' investment in women, but that may have been changed by this post-COVID equilibrium that may make that less of a signal. And so we see some suggestive evidence of faster employment growth for mothers with small children after the pandemic, which is consistent with that theory, although we think that there's going to be more time for the sort of dust to settle for other things with the pandemic. So I won't talk quite as much about that. So we think of this paper as contributing to a couple strands of related literature. So one is the debate about the effects of remote work on mothers. And there, Claudia Golden and others have argued theoretically that the rise of remote work should be a really big boon to mothers. But during the COVID period itself, there were really unequal burdens of childcare responsibilities. And so that may make it hard to see the impact of remote work on mothers' attachment to the labor market using the COVID experiment. And so we're going to try to study the changes in remote work in a more stable childcare period. We're also contributing to this existing puzzle of why remote work wasn't more prevalent before the pandemic, despite the fact that it's reasonably productive in lots of settings and workers seem to have a high willingness to pay for it. We make the argument that those who valued it the most may have also had the most to lose from asking for remote work if it signaled lower attachment to the labor market. Okay, so from here I'll talk about the data, then go through the empirics. So we're primarily going to be using census data, which gives us information on whether people are primarily working from home. And so this is a bit of a coarse measure. It's telling us whether they're working from home most of the time, as opposed to more people use it sort of more sporadically. Importantly, it's also going to give us college degree information. And that's really useful for us when thinking about employment because it gives us information on people's skills and how suitable they are to remote work, even when they're not working. Whereas opposed to say something like occupation where we only see it when people are employed. We're also going to see labor market outcomes and standard demographics, and we're going to be particularly focused on mothers defined as women with children where the eldest child is under 15, but we could also focus on women with smaller children, and the results are pretty similar. We're also going to supplement this with American Time Use Survey data, which is going to be important in giving us a more continuous measure of remote work. We see a time diary on a random day, and so we can see people who maybe are using remote work more sporadically as opposed to every day. And we can also use information on the intensive margin of remote work. There's lots of people who do some remote work in the evenings, even if they spend most of their day in the office. And finally, we're going to use the current population survey to try to get at what's happened in this post-COVID world, because that goes up to 2023, whereas the census that's publicly available at the micro level only goes up to 2021 currently. Finally, we're going to use a little bit of information on occupations from ONA, and particularly we're going to use information on occupations that are computer intensive in two senses. One, that you're working with computers to write programs and do some other sort of technical things. And then we're also going to use a measure of using computers to communicate and do less technical work. Okay, so now getting into the technological changes and work from home before the pandemic. So here we're looking, the x-axis is the year, the y-axis is the share of people who are working from home most of the time from the ACS. And this is the quantile of computer importance within the occupation. And so we're seeing, consistent with the story at the beginning of the talk, that we're seeing rises in this primarily working from home in these computer intensive occupations in the blue here. And that was much stronger than these less intensive computer occupations. And this particularly mattered for mothers. So strikingly, you can see that mothers in these computer intensive occupations, even in 2019, almost 15% of them were working from home most of the time. And this is even more dramatic if you look in the American Time Use Survey at working from home some of the time. We also see a relatively similar pattern when we look at a very different set of occupations of ones that are intensive in communication and media, so using computers in very different ways. So that suggests that there's going to be some college degrees during this period where there's rises in remote work and others that are relatively less impacted. So that's how we're going to try to characterize women's skill sets and how big a change they saw in remote work. And so first, to make things concrete, we can think of a couple of examples. So people with education degrees were relatively less likely to work from home, and that didn't also change very much over this period. They were kind of tied to the schoolhouse or what have you. Marketing, by contrast, is a pretty computer-intensive occupation. You have lots of people who are using computers for both communication and to some extent analysis. And there you see a much larger increase in work from home of about 0.3 percentage points each year. And so we're going to characterize every college degree according to this measure. And so that's going to give us this variation in how big a change there was in remote work across all college degrees. And so these are just the biggest college degrees. We do it for all of them, but it sort of intuitively makes sense. A lot of things that have a big in-person component had small changes in work from home before the pandemic, whereas things that were computer intensive in one way or another are the ones that are seeing the biggest increase. And a thing that's worth noting here is here to the left, we are categorizing those degrees sort of mechanically as those that have the biggest versus the smallest changes in work from home. And so that's allowing us to see that there's meaningful changes in primarily working from home, but there's much bigger changes in sort of these measures of hybrid work. On any given day, the likelihood that you are working from home increased a lot in the occupations associated with these increasingly remotable degrees relative to those where they weren't so suitable to remote work. And even this we should think of as being an understatement of how big this trend was, because this is just capturing the people who happened to be working from home on the day that they were interviewed. It's going to be even bigger when you think about the people who have the option value of working from home. This is an even more intensive measure of remote work, where here we're looking at the share of people who are working from home during work hours. And we categorize it separately by people working from home during business hours versus outside of business hours. And so here you're seeing that in general, before the pandemic, people were doing a lot of their late night work, for example, at home, and that was particularly true in these remotable degrees. And that you might think that that would be particularly important for mothers who might find it particularly costly to be in the office during the evening. So now we can turn to how this relates to changes in mothers' employment. And so here we can go back to our example of education versus marketing and look at the changes in mothers' employment during this period. So mothers were increasingly likely to be employed in both types of degrees, but the rate of growth was much larger for marketing. You might be worried that there's just other things happening with marketing. Employment in general could be rising. So we contrast what we see here with what we see for women without children. And there we see more parallel changes, if anything, a little bit stronger for education. And so what we're most focused on is this difference, the change in mothers' employment relative to that of other women. And so for that, we see much bigger impacts for marketing than for education. And so then we can do that for every single degree, the same method, and correlate the changes in mothers' employment versus non-mothers with the changes in work from home. And that produces this picture of looking at, for every different college degree, what was the change in work from home during this decade before the pandemic, and then what was the change in mothers' employment relative to that of other women. And we see this really strong positive correlation where things like marketing have big changes in work from home, big changes in mothers' employment relative to non-mothers, and then education's on sort of the other end of the spectrum. Obviously, I'm the one who chose those examples, so you might think that they were selected. Here, this sort of illustrates that that is part of the more general trend, that degrees like marketing that saw big changes in work from home are also the ones that saw changes in mothers' employment, and those that have more of an in-person component saw much less of a change during this period. This just puts the same thing in table form. We're seeing that a 1 percentage point change in work from home is associated with even more than a 1 percentage point change in mothers' employment relative to non-mothers. In some ways, that magnitude on its face seems way too big. I think it's much more reasonable when you think of this as being a very small measure of a much bigger change in locational flexibility. This is people who are primarily working from home. There's similar trends for people who have some degree of hybrid work that is probably at least twice as big, probably more like, I would guess, more like 4 times as big as this. So that makes this magnitude seem a little bit more plausible. We can also see that it's not being driven by other correlated changes in the nature of work within these degrees. You might be worried about lots of other things. So you might be worried that the change in mothers' attachment to the labor market is actually what's driving the change in work from home, that as mothers become more attached, they advocate for work from home, and so we have reverse causality. You can define the change in work from home using just the sample of men, and you get really similar results. We can also do a triple difference with fathers, where we look at the change in mothers' employment vis-a-vis women without children and compare it to fathers' employment vis-a-vis men without children. And the results for that are almost identical. And so this suggests that it is something about mothers specifically, that they benefit maybe more from this locational flexibility. We can also look at other measures of women's labor market outcomes. So we can look at hours, for example, and there we're seeing increases in mothers' hours relative to that for women without children in these more remotable or increasingly remotable degrees. That largely goes away when we condition on being employed. So most of that's coming from the extensive margin. But this is suggesting that it's not just that we're pushing women from not being employed into working really short part-time jobs. It seems that the whole distribution is moving up because of locational flexibility. We're also seeing increases in log income in these degrees, even when we condition on employment, suggesting maybe being able to work those evenings is helping women advance in their career, even over and above being employed. Okay, so now we're going to think about, we've shown you some evidence here that remote work seems to be particularly valuable for mothers and their ability to work. Why weren't more of them working from home before the pandemic? Why was it just 15% in these computer-oriented occupations and not like 80%? And so to think about that question, we're gonna develop this signaling theory of the choice to work from home, which I'm just gonna sketch out briefly. In that model, firms are gonna be able to invest in workers' skills, and that's gonna pay off only if workers persist in the labor market. Mothers are gonna have private information about their attachment to the labor market and their likelihood then of it paying off for the firm to invest in them. Work from home can mitigate the cost of working, and that's gonna be particularly valuable for those women who find it particularly costly to work and who are likely to drop out. There's also going to be a fixed cost initially of adopting remote work. Because work from home is more valuable for mothers with high costs of working, asking to work from home is going to signal low attachment. We're going to argue that before the pandemic, we may have been in this separating equilibrium, where because it sent a signal of low attachment to ask for to work from home, firms were leery of investing in mothers who made that request. And so as a result, high attachment mothers are going to work from on site because they want the firm to invest in them, whereas low attachment mothers are going to work from home or drop out. We argue that because the pandemic overcame these fixed costs of adopting remote work, it's plausible that now we're more likely to be in a pooling equilibrium where all mothers choose to work from home, at least to some extent. And so it sends much less of a signal about your attachment to the workforce. Firms then invest in mothers regardless of their locational choice. And that opens up the possibility that women can use remote work much more fully than they did before the pandemic. We think that the dust is still sort of settling to be able to test that prediction, but we do see some suggestive evidence when we look in the CPS and we look at employment of college-educated women and differentiate them by the age of their eldest kid. So here in Black, there's women without children, and then the other lines are women with children, and particularly the lower lines are women with young children. And we do see some evidence that there's faster employment growth for these women with young children compared to other women in the wake of the pandemic when they've been able to use this locational flexibility in a much bigger way. Okay, so to conclude, we just talked about sort of how technological changes led to changes in remote work for some degrees versus others before the pandemic. And mothers were more likely to use that locational flexibility, and it seems to be strongly related to changes in their employment patterns. And so then we argued that it may not have been used more before the pandemic, in part because we were in this equilibrium in which asking for remote work signaled lower attachment. Thanks.
Hi, a great paper. So I have a suggestion, which is I think you can compute the rates of return on different majors, first under the pre-pandemic assumption of typical working periods, and then compare it to the post-pandemic differences in working periods, right? So majors are going to have a higher payoff now that you'll spend more time in the workforce. So there's a paper by Keith Chen and Judith Chevalier who argues that women actually have low rates of return in many professions, like nursing in particular, exactly because women are spending so much time out of the workforce. Now that that's changed, I suspect many majors actually have much higher rates of return for women. And I also wonder how much that's leading to endogenous changes in enrollment. So at NYU Stern, we actually have now more female applications for business school that compared to than men. So there's a huge change in that dimension as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I mean, I think something that we didn't talk about at all, but I think it's exciting is like the ones that have seen the biggest changes in remote work are really remunerative occupations and also ones where women are really underrepresented. So I do think it's going to potentially change the distribution of women across majors. It's a great point.
It'd be interesting to see whether the effects you're measuring are stronger in metro areas with high traffic congestion. So in other words, work from home is more attractive in LA than it is in Kansas City, where congestion is less.
Yeah, that's a great point. I can tell that you're also a Matt Kahn co-author. He's been pushing me in that direction. So I think it's definitely on the to-do list.
So my recollection from working with the work from home data from the ACS is that the rates are much higher for the self-employed. And in terms of the models, something that you may want to think about is that the choice of working from home or not often means, at least before the pandemic, it often meant choosing to be self-employed versus working for a firm, which also involves more labor market risk.
Yeah, that's a great point. So in general, a sort of interesting thing is that pre-pandemic, mothers were much more likely to, who had small children, were much more likely to be self-employed than women who were similar but didn't have children. And that was like all because that was the way that you could do remote work. These trends, I think somewhat surprisingly to me, women aren't more likely to become self-employed in these increasingly remotable degrees, maybe because, you know, that is traditionally the way to be remote, but as it becomes a better substitute, then maybe they are able to get remote jobs even within firms. That's a great point.
So Emma, super cool. Two thoughts. So first, I was thinking whether some of these trends might change even more, because some of the professions where you had low share of working from home earlier, like nursing and education, it's become more acceptable now with telemedicine to do nursing from afar, and secondary education, you can do classes on Zoom. So I would be really curious how this plays out, because we have changed many professions. The other thing I was thinking was, in terms of another outcome, you could look at career continuity, because at least anecdotally, lots of women in dual career situations are now able to not give up their jobs because the spouse has moved, because they can work remotely. So
yeah, those are great points.
I'd add on to what he said over here about the entrepreneur piece. So you kind of answered that part. The other one, in terms of pre and post data, you can get looking at a specific employer and seeing where they used to have very low work from home rates, and then it's increased rapidly in the same organizations, often with the same people, federal government. There's a lot of open data on that. We can talk about it if you want.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, I think that would be really cool.
Hi, this is Emma Williams-Barron. Thank you for this very compelling paper. This is fantastic. And one thing I'm concerned about is potentially if mothers are working from home much more, this could more deeply entrench unequal divisions of household labor. And I wonder if you could speculate about how that would fit into your signaling theory here and how employers might respond to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, a striking thing in the American Time Use Survey is that when people are working from home, it's really frequent that they have secondary childcare as one of their activities. So I do think that that's an issue. And there's a nice paper by Abby Adams-Prassel saying that a lot of times women are less productive at home because they potentially are juggling multiple things. And so I do think that that's a consideration. I mean, I think that may be part of the reason that pre-pandemic it was used in this sparing way, that like you could work from home at these late hours when the kids were already in bed, and that was like a potentially very productive time. So I think that that's definitely an interesting question that we'll think more about.
I just wanted to ask about the data sets that you're drawing on and whether you think they're going to change and evolve to ask deeper questions, because my sense is that quite a lot of the data that's been collated about women is a bit patchy.
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. I mean, I think it would be great to have more detailed measures of flexibility in these data sets. So, I mean, something that's been a struggle to some extent in this paper is thinking about just how many people had some degree of hybrid work before the pandemic. I think that our sense is that that was something that came out of COVID, but I think particularly for mothers, that was something that they were using beforehand. And that's something that's sometimes missed in these questions, maybe because they're not as much geared towards thinking about the specific work concerns of mothers.
Emma, I don't know how feasible this is, but I'm wondering if it's possible with any of the subsets of data to look at US versus other countries. Because one of the things that we actually saw during the course of the pandemic was the issue of work from home with mothers was most acute in the US, followed by the UK, and then continental Europe was not quite as bad because of more infrastructure, child leave, other implications, and that the US just hasn't had.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I've been mainly focused on looking in the US currently, but I think that could be a very interesting direction.
Hi, Emma. Great paper. Thank you. I was wondering if you're concerned about the role of childcare provision stability in these comparisons. So before the pandemic, probably mothers were not working remotely as frequently was because childcare availability was a lot more stable compared to the period right after COVID when we saw a lot of interruptions in the childcare provision. So just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that that's part of the reason we are currently pretty cautious in how we're interpreting the COVID period. So I mean, if you projected what we saw in the pre-COVID trends to think about the massive increase in remote work, that would suggest that like the motherhood penalty and employment should really decrease, particularly in remotable degrees. And we don't really see that. We see sort of a continuation of this trend as opposed to a huge level shift up. And I think we're optimistic that maybe once childcare normalizes, we'll be able to see a little bit more of that. But I think that that is part of the picture. And I think something else we could do in more of the geographic vein is think about like, do we want to maybe control for like what the childcare availability is like and how that may interact with this picture?
That was fantastic. One question on the quantification was, I often think it would be nice to know how much work from home increases GDP. And you could do some numbers from this actually. There's at least 2 people from the Fed. This thing even feeds into things like interest rate policy. So I think you could estimate impact of this on labor force participation rates, which gives, think of a classic solo model that's just going to push up Ellen. In fact, it's also skewed Ellen. It's like high quality labor that's increasingly working as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if the numbers you get out of this were like tens or hundreds of billions of dollars, like really large numbers, because if you're pushing up female labor force participation by, I don't know, 2-3%, and it's highly educated women as well, the numbers, actually, I think the numbers would be absolutely enormous.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
You mentioned Abby Adams-Prassel's paper where she finds that it's parents of kids under 5. And I know that in your robustness, you've looked at mothers with kids under 5 versus those with 15. But building on the 2 points from over here, it seems as though you could leverage policy changes, both in paid leave that sort of New York State has implemented, but also in childcare provision to make sure that it actually is about having your kid at home. So introducing, childcare that is public and paid for that starts at age 3 or 4 rather than at age 5 might give you some leverage to look at the impact there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, and thinking about how it interacts with these trends, I think could also be interesting. I mean, I think some of my interpretation of this is partly that it is in a more stable childcare period. And so it's partly this is so valuable because it allows you to not work from home most days, but be like ready when your kid is sick to like go pick them up and not have that be a huge disruption and be able to continue working that day and be available during weekends or in the evening to be able to take calls. So it's maybe not, the mental model I had in mind was not so much that people were doing this all the time, but doing it sort of sporadically. But I should think more if there are ways to more directly say that like that is the underlying mechanism.
And now we're going to go on to what works for her, how work from home digital jobs affect female labor force participation by Suhani Jalota.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suhani Jalota, and I'm a PhD student here at Stanford. And I'm going to be presenting my job market paper, What Works for Her, How Work from Home Digital Jobs Affect Female Labor Force Participation. This is joint work along with another PhD student at MIT, Lisa Ho. And as part of this paper, we offered jobs to more than 3,000 women for over 60 days and set up 35 community centers to understand what might be constraining female labor force participation in India and try to shed some light on social norms as an influence in constraining these women as well. So married women's labor force participation rates are quite low in many emerging countries around the world. India is an outlier even to that trend, where despite its dramatic economic growth, we've seen that labor force participation rates remain even lower than 25% for women. And this tends to be even lower for urban women and for women that are in fact more educated. So the middle educated women seem to have the lowest labor force participation rates, despite increasing education doesn't really translate into into employment. Now, most of these statistics are true for jobs that are located outside the house, which are most jobs today. But as this audience knows, there are many other opportunities, but most of the jobs available to these women tend to be outside the house. And married women particularly seem to have about 1/5 the labor force participation rate as compared to unmarried women. And so as part of this study, we really are focused on married women only. And there are many constraints, as this audience is very, very familiar with jobs that are located outside the house. There's just practical barriers to do with safety, travel-related concerns where women can't leave their home because of these concerns. There could also be just other inability to multitask along with childcare or housework concerns, where unpaid work seems to be really high. There's also information-related barriers where women might just not know what types of credible, trusted information about jobs or what jobs are available outside the home. They could also face various social norm-related barriers where they're just not allowed by their families to step out of their house and work. There's just a lot of pressure. There are these gender norms that expect women to just stay home. And there's been various research by economists and social scientists done to explore many of these different barriers, particularly the safety, the practical, and the information-related barriers have been more explored because they tend to be less complex in terms of actually studying than the social norm-related barriers. In this study particularly, we're trying to understand which of these constraints seem to be more important in determining middle-educated married women's labor force participation. And this, for us to study this question, we need to be able to separate out these different practical information and social norm-related constraints, particularly controlling for constraints that we can more easily control for, like the practical and information-related barriers, to be able to better understand the influence of social norms in constraining women. We also want to understand that if by reducing these constraints, these practical information constraints, some social norm constraints as well, can we actually increase labor force participation of these women? And if so, then really by how much? And so now to study these questions, we need to find a job intervention that can help us disentangle the practical information and social norm barriers that tend to be quite intertwined with jobs that are located outside the house. And so to be able to reduce and control for some of these practical barriers, we need a job that is at home or near home that controls for many of the safety and travel-related concerns. We need a job that's part-time or flexible that allows women to choose the timing of her work. Maybe the work itself is only 2 hours a day at a time of her choice. That allows her to multitask along with the unpaid housework and childcare burden that she has. The job intervention would also need to be child-friendly so that she can manage along with childcare, and also women only, where in this context, we know that male coworkers tend to pose potentially a safety risk on women and might decrease labor force participation that way. We also want to control for some of these information-related barriers that women might experience. And so to reduce and minimize those, we should provide information about the job to women multiple times and at home, where we can provide it to them in a language and a way that is really accessible by them, and is also provided to them on their own devices that they're already quite familiar with, such as their own smartphones, and in person. We also want to provide women with a job that itself, by its nature, is quite accessible and easily understandable by a population that's middle educated or middle skilled. So as we tried to find a job that met all of this criteria and would help us study our research questions, and we couldn't find any exactly fitting this bill, we developed our own digital gig work platform for women from home and from centers. This is a women-only gig work platform called Rani Work. You can see a snapshot of this here, where we've taken already existing tasks that are being performed in large business process outsourcing, BPO companies, large call centers, and converted them into micro tasks that can be performed by women over their own smartphones through this mobile application. And these tasks are things like image annotation, speech recordings, speech transcriptions, which are then used to train various AI models by various companies. These women can also perform these tasks from 35 local child-friendly centers that we set up. And all of these centers are trying to mimic a home environment as closely possible as we can. So they're located in women's own communities, maybe just a 2 to 5 minute walk for most women in this setting. So a lot of the safety, travel, the practical barriers, and the information-related barriers are also quite minimized. minimized. And these women, while the tasks that I presented to you here are quite tailored for this particular application, there are many companies that are trying to provide gig work already to people around the world that are being used to train various AI models. We've just taken this work that is normally not accessible by this population and converted it to a more accessible format for them. So first, I'll provide you with an overview as to just where we're going. It's a short talk, so very briefly, then talk about the experiment design and then our results. So to be able to understand our research questions and understand which of these constraints between practical information, social norm barriers might really be constraining women, we run a randomized control trial where we randomly assign women to either a home-based treatment or a center-based treatment, both of which are minimizing or trying to minimize the practical and information-related barriers that women experience, but only home controls for some of these additional social norm-related barriers that might be expecting women to stay home. We also randomly assign women to different wage levels, as we're interested in also understanding whether we can financially compensate women to be able to overcome some of these costs and take up maybe work from other locations. So the main finding of the study is that even when we are offering women jobs from these local flexible centers in their own communities where they literally just need to step out and walk to the center, the job take up from home is double that from these centers. And that no matter the wage, so even when we are offering women 5 times higher wages, that is equivalent to a monthly household income, it does not increase supply at these centers. We also then try to understand, well, what is causing this large difference between home and centers? And so we run a follow-up experiment where we then try to disentangle some of these effects. And we find that the actual housework burden and not actually childcare as much might be explaining some of this difference. And that some of this difference is also really explained by some results that we have that point towards social norms that might be keeping women home. We also run a mini experiment with husbands where we offer them the exact same wage levels and the exact locations. And we find that this difference is actually quite gendered in that husbands are pretty wage elastic, but not actually sensitive to location, and that only women seem to be displaying this sort of behavior. We also then ultimately talk about, and we don't get into these results as much today, but as relevant for this audience is that we find that the marginal productivity from centers seems to be slightly higher, and there might also be other benefits to working from centers. So what do we really do in the experiment? So we run a household survey, a baseline survey with about 3,300 women and households. We then randomly assign them to either receiving a home-based treatment or a center-based treatment. We then cross-randomize them into 3 different wage levels: a low wage at about $60 a month, a medium wage at $150 a month, and a high wage at about $300 a month. So the high wage is 5 times that of the low wage and is about the average husband income. This gives us about 6 treatments here. And then we have an additional control arm, which doesn't receive any of the job offers, but just receives a baseline and line survey. We also randomly assign households to either receiving a husband survey or not. And this is where the survey team is also providing the job details to the husbands. And we look at the take-up rates by husbands for these surveys as a proxy for husband job refusal. And we don't get into those results here, but I just wanted to highlight that. And we also did run an N-line survey and then do some follow-up experiments that I'll just talk about. So we run this field experiment in Mumbai slum resettlement communities, where the average age of the women in this sample is about 32 years. We have about 50% of the sample in an open caste or general caste category. We have 50% of the women who have young children below the age of 8. Almost all the women, majority of the women have children in the sample. About 50% are Hindu and they're middle educated, so about 11th grade pass, and about 40% of them have their in-laws living with them as well. So we also have some survey measures around whether or not women think they're allowed to work by their husbands, and explicitly women state that 30% of them are not allowed to work in a job by their husbands. So this is how the treatment looked like for work from home, where women are just working on their own smartphones. Very similar in centers, women are working on their smartphones, but are also able to bring their kids along with them to these centers as well that we set up. And the centers are all located in the same building setups where their homes are, so the layout is pretty similar to the work environment as well. So now that we have assigned women to home and center and the different wage levels as part of this experiment, what happens to their labor supply? Now, at baseline, all of the women were not employed. So our eligibility criteria required that women were not employed in any full-time employment or anything more than 20 hours a week. So now, given that, we find that reducing these practical information constraints and maybe some of these social norm constraints, like in the home environment, we're able to increase labor force participation here at the extensive margin, at least by 56%. And that's pretty large, given that the willingness to work in this context is actually also very high, but it's does not normally translate to employment because maybe of a lot of these different barriers that have persisted. But if we can control for some of these barriers, we do actually see that the labor supply could increase. And now when we look at the same sort of a job, exact same job, but from a center setting, which is right outside, we see that the take-up is about half. So there does seem to be this large premium on work from home, even when the center is next door. And this is when we're averaging this out for the 3 different wage levels. Now, when we separate this out by wage, we see that generally conditional on location, women are wage inelastic. So if even when we offer women $300 a month from home, it doesn't increase take-up. From centers as well, there's a slight increase between the low and the medium wage from centers, but that's likely because there's a slightly higher reservation wage from centers, but generally wage inelastic. And that by paying women more to join centers, not necessarily going to be an effective solution at the extensive margin. We don't see this trend. We see the opposite result kind of for husbands, where husbands' labor supply seems to be quite responsive to wages, particularly by the high wage, and that it is not generally quite responsive at all by location at any of the wage levels. So this response seems to be pretty gendered. So now we want to understand, well, why is it? And which of these constraints is more important for women, given that these home-based jobs are already quite flexible, very similar to the home environment, and were already child-friendly and providing childcare, which seems to be one of the largest constraints for women's work. So maybe there's still, even for the 2 hours a day that women are working at a time of their choice, maybe there's still some persisting household responsibility, some other childcare, housework that they're not able to control for. They could also be maybe persisting safety travel concerns, maybe some other information barriers that we're not able to control for. Or some of these social norms, the norms of domesticity that are expecting women to just stay home, even if they don't have actual burden of housework and childcare. So through our various survey work, we find that the safety travel concerns and the information-related barriers in this context, given the design of the experiment, don't really seem to be at play. So women are not necessarily rejecting jobs because of these reasons, but it could be due to housework and housework responsibilities and social norms. So we try to then explore these mechanisms a little bit more. So first off, we find that childcare might not actually be driving a key difference between this gap between home and center, given that women from centers were already able to bring their kids to the center. And so we see that women that have young children and don't have young children don't differentially necessarily take up the job from centers. So women with young children are not taking it up any less. And so then we try to understand the housework burden versus the social norms through this follow-up experiment, where at Endline, we then randomly reassign women into either receiving a home-based or a center-based treatment like we had in the primary experiment. In addition to that, we add 3 other sort of complications in work from home that are making them even closer to a home-based environment, so making them even more costly. So we add an E2 arm, which is no multitasking. So women are continuing to work from home, but they can't multitask along with other housework or childcare responsibilities. How do we enforce this? It's a digital platform, so we can introduce notifications that women have to immediately respond to, otherwise the tasks expire and they lose money. So this is our test for the actual housework burden. We then also add treatment arms E3 and E4, which is where women are working from home, but they need to step out of their house to check in at a local center. That's again a 2 to 5 minute walk from their house. They're just getting a code that unlocks their application and they come home and they work from home again. But they have to be visible, so they have to be seen stepping out of the house and working. And in the ID arm, we add an additional social signal that a woman actually has to wear a work ID while walking to the center and back, making it even more obvious why she's leaving home. So these two we're trying to use to test the observed norms of domesticity. There's still a lot about social norms that we're not able to capture in these experiments. And if also these arms were perfectly executed the way we designed them, then I think that the results that we would have seen might have also been a little bit more drastic, but we do see slightly underestimate of these results, which I'll just show you. So first off, we see similar results in this follow-up experiment as we saw in the primary experiment for take-up from centers being proportionately 66% lower than the take-up from home. Now, when we add the no multitasking arm, we see that this take-up reduces proportionately by about 19%. So that means that the housework burden might be explaining some of this difference, but not the largest chunk of this difference. And that this check-in at the centers and the check-in NID might also be explaining some more of this difference because it proportionately decreases the take-up by about 30%. We still have some other unobserved differences that we then talk a little bit more about in the paper and attribute some more results that we find where we talk about why this might be driven by some more social norms as well. So this audience is particularly quite knowledgeable about this, and we have not done a very detailed analysis into the productivity or the intensive margin results, but I'll show you a preview into what we have a little bit here. So now that we have 56% of the women actually entering in home-based work, about 27% in center-based work, what happens to them now? And because this type of job is actually piece rate, performance pay, we can actually observe productivity by task, and we can do this for over 2 months of the women were working on the platform. So first off, we see that the marginal productivity from centers is somewhat higher, so about 14% higher across the distribution. And this is, just to remind you, in this particular treatment, we did not provide any training to the women from home or center. There was no additional monitoring done from home as well. So potentially, and this is a combination of selection effect and a treatment effect. Through some other work that we've done, we find that this is a split by about a third, 2/3. So a third is a selection effect, and about 2/3 seems to be the treatment effect in this case. And that generally also when we look at retention rates and completion of the work over the 2 months, that worker retention seems to be somewhat higher also from centers conditional on working. So this is conditional on working, that more women are staying and continuing to do the work from centers. The women that seem to drop out from home also seem to be women that seem to realize over time that they're not allowed to work by their husbands and then tend to drop out. So we have some evidence to show that as well. But from centers, this sort of triaging into whether or not you're allowed to work tends to happen before. So it tends to happen at the extensive margin when choosing whether or not to work. But at home, they seem to realize this over time. Maybe women have hidden the fact that they're working from their husbands. It's a pretty unobservable job. They can just be seen as playing on YouTube or something, but they're actually working in this job. So they find out over time and then they become less allowed. We also see that retention rates tend to flatten out at about this medium wage, $150 a month, but it tends to be quite low at low wage. So this is where wages do really seem to matter for women, which is at the completion rate. And the market wage for such jobs is about $120 to $150 a month. So this is in line with what we see for the retention. So we'd expect that about 25% of women from home would likely be sustained on such a work platform given the market wage, and about 15% or so from centers would do the same. So finally, when we control for some of these practical and information related barriers, we see that female labor force participation can increase even from these center-based jobs, these hubs within women's own communities by about 25% at the extensive margin. And that we can't really increase the statistic even more by more financial compensation, as higher wages in this context doesn't really seem to be an effective policy tool. And that's likely because women are constrained by additional things that are not able to be overcome by wages, maybe like social norm constraints. But we could provide women with home-based jobs to overcome some of these, to increase the take-up of these jobs by a lot more. At the same time, you want to design these home-based jobs in a way that is also a little bit more productive and is allowing women to be able to also benefit from some of these additional gains that women can otherwise have from centers, potentially with some sort of a hybrid model or stepping out and, doing some sort of work from home, but then also meeting others from time to time. So we're doing further research now to look at the effects of work from home and working from centers on women's agency, mental health, further employment, permanent employment outcomes as well. And we're just, we don't have the results right now to present to you on that yet. But thank you so much. This was our paper on what works for her, and I'd be open to your questions.
Hi, amazing paper. Thank you so much for talking about it. I was wondering, you mentioned that there was about half of the targeted participants who were living with in-laws. And it's interesting to see because ex ante, there's evidence on both sides. So people who live with in-laws might also face stricter regulation regarding like social norms. So like Anukriti's work talks about how women who live with their in-laws have a harder time forming social networks and a harder time participating in the labor force. But on the other hand, they might also contribute to some of these domestic chores that the burden of which falls on women. So I was wondering if you were able to do some of the heterogeneity analysis and see how this impact varies.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a great point. So we actually collected quite extensive data on in-laws involvement. So whether or not they were living with them, whether they were living close by, whether they were living in the same like city even. And we don't find any heterogeneity by in-laws. And that seems to be because of this dual, like it's pushing up and down. For some women, it's really helping with childcare, housework burden. And for other women, it might be more constraining. So overall, the effect is not different by the in-laws. There's a separate paper though on the mother-in-law effect, showing that ultimately it seems to be a positive thing, ironically, for women to be able to actually work because the housework burden is just so large and it needs to be shared. Yes.
This is excellent work. Thank you. Do you see any difference based conditional on household income or the husband's employment status? That's number one. And then also, do these women tend to have their own bank accounts as it is simply the fact of being paid revealing then to the rest of the household that they are working?
Okay, great questions. Yeah, so on the first one, by husband's occupation, almost all the husbands are actually employed in this context. And so I think it's about 85 or 90% of them are employed in full-time sort of work. So we're not able to necessarily see any heterogeneity by that. With husband income, we do. So generally richer households seem to have lower labor force participation rates across the board. So that could be the income effect. That could be an additional signaling effect where you're trying to signal that I'm well off and so I don't want my wife to work. We're not able to separate those two effects out. We would have really liked to, and we tried really hard trying to do that. But we often get pushed back that it could just be the income effect, and it really could be. And then on the second question on could you remind me again? It was so on the financial inclusion bit, this is all digital work, so it's digital payments as well, and only about 40% of our sample had their own bank accounts when we started. So everyone, including the control group, was offered to open a bank account if they did not have one under their own name, and most payments went into their own bank accounts under their own name, so they could hide it if they wanted from their husbands. But if women explicitly said, no, we want it to be in our husband's account, we did not stop that either. So it was on the women, but we opened bank accounts so we had, I think, about more than 300 bank accounts that we had to open as part of this.
Thanks. So I love this study, partly because it confirms my prior that work from home offers tremendous opportunities to bring disenfranchised groups into the labor market. In your setting, it's women, but other settings. But in terms of the stuff about mechanisms is great. But the headline result is so large, the potential to double the labor supply of these groups of women. And there's a sense in which the mechanisms are secondary. Okay, and I want to elaborate on that point in two respects. First, I believe the domesticity norms are in fact a very powerful factor that's repressing labor supply outside the household. So I'm totally sold on that. But the accumulation of earnings over time has the potential to erode that social norm because my guess is it's probably partly sustained by the fact that there's an extreme imbalance of financial resources within the household between the men and the woman or the woman and her parents the parents if she's living with the in-laws or whatever. So in some longer term sense, it's not clear that you're actually getting to the full effect on social norms and so on. But the other thing is, suppose I'm an employer. I want to train AI programs and I want to tap into this labor pool. Again, I don't care what the mechanism is. If these people can do the work, especially if I can pay them piece rate that's 10% lower than what I get in alternative markets, there's a profit motive to scale this up tremendously. So it's great to keep doing the experiments on the mechanisms, but I was also trying to figure out a way to cooperate with a party that has a commercial interest in scaling up what you've done, because that's what's going to really drive the social transformations.
Completely agree on that. On the first point on social norms, there is this additional breadwinner norm, which is also what we were trying to study here, that if you give women a wage that's higher than their husbands, it might actually, in this context, it was not as concerning because it was a short-term job, but actually for longer-term permanent jobs, that could be more of a concern. So we had women hide, especially in the high wage arm, they were hiding more from their husbands. And they could do that because they said it was project-based, so right now it's okay. But if this is a permanent salary that I would keep getting for a long time, it would threaten him so much that it might cause her to exit entirely or work in a different kind of lower paying job. So there is something to do with this longer term social norms that we haven't been able to capture also here. And on the private company bit, absolutely. So Rani Work itself actually is now working with various companies and is continuing work for women on the platform and in these communities. And the idea is to definitely take this to the government even, and where there's a national urban livelihood mission. So normally in agriculture and in rural areas, we're able to get people unemployed into the workforce, even just for 100 days of part-time employment. There's nothing equivalent to that in the urban sector, in the urban areas. And so we're trying to propose this as a solution for that and being like, this can be great part-time work that even the government can provide and propose.
Hi, I wondered if you asked what they spent the money on or what they intended to spend the money on, kind of to speak to this hidden income or to speak to kind of income pooling more widely.
Right. Most of them, so we have these details for the women, and most of them tend to spend it on their children. So it's primarily they're saving for their children or spending for their children, and across all the wages, but particularly in the high wage arm, they're saving more, but again, for their children's education and their future. So it's hard, it's I think only about 10% on anything to do with personal expenses. And when it's personal expenses, it tends to be own health bills. So something to do with their healthcare or like sometimes even just nice clothes. And so that's what we saw came up often for women, but otherwise it's always children.
This is awesome. I was just curious whether within your study it was possible to differentiate between like religious groups. In the US, remote work among mothers was really high before the pandemic in Utah. That seems probably not random. So I was wondering in your setting if it's possible to do something similar.
Yeah, and we do see that. So for Muslim women in our sample versus non-Muslim women, that Muslim women tend to be a lot less allowed to work. So the completion rates, both from home and from center, are much lower, almost 30% lower for Muslim women. And they seem to be learning whether or not they're allowed to work through this process. So in the follow-up experiment, they're even less likely to even start working. And this confirms some of our beliefs that generally women in this context are not even aware whether or not they'd be fully allowed because they've never had this conversation before. So they learn as part of this experiment that whether or not they're actually allowed. And so in N-line, we see that the more women are not allowed to work, but that's only because they seem to have realized this after talking.
So how high does the household income and education have to get before these social norms weaken sufficiently to allow women outside the house?
I wish I had an answer to that.
But I mean, anecdotally, what is the answer?
So honestly, I mean, we've seen as incomes increase that norms are getting worse. Higher caste women in India tend to have worse norms because you kind of want to signal that you're doing better off. So it's not clear if it actually gets better with education or with income. And so we don't really know if there's a tipping point or where it goes back. I mean,
so if you were living in India and you had a PhD from Stanford, you would be at home instead of?
So for tertiary, for women with tertiary education levels, we do see that it increases slightly. So the unemployed, essentially about 56% of women that are illiterate or uneducated are in the labor force. This is about 20% for middle educated and 25% for tertiary educated. So if you have a PhD or a master's degree, so it increases slightly, but it's still quite likely that a woman with a PhD in India is maybe not employed if she's married, because it just seems that nobody's sharing the housework burden, and India is ranks last in the world when it comes to this share of housework burden along with husbands, because husbands really don't contribute at all.
So two thoughts, Suhani. So loved your study and completely echo what Steve said. These effects are just like one, really, really eye-opening. So two thoughts. I was wondering if there's variation. You could exploit the variation around the age of the woman. And my prior would be the older woman will probably care less about the opinions of the husband or the in-laws. And I'm curious if you've looked at that.
Yeah.
But also on the productivity effect, since you're exploring that now, I was wondering if you could consider maybe in a future intervention, a hybrid model, because, in your center thing, they were sitting together. And I'm wondering if there are learning effects happening there that are not happening at home. And one way to test that would be for the home people to have them periodically, maybe once a week, come and give them feedback on their work and see if their productivity then closes the gap. So beyond teasing out the selection and treatment effects, if you can also induce some learning effects for the folks working from home.
Absolutely. I think those are great ideas. By age, we do find that older women care a little bit less, so they are more likely to work, but not that much more. And yeah, absolutely. I think a hybrid is where we want to study next as well.
So some of the motivating facts that you began with were differences by labor force participation rate across different countries. And it was striking how low India was relative to other countries with the same GDP per capita. And so I'm wondering whether you thought about sort of returning to some of those facts at the end and trying to relate some of your work on mechanisms to ask whether they can explain those differences. And sort of related to that, from what I understand, the differences in women's labor force participation across different Indian states are maybe as large as the cross-country differences that you showed there. And it seems natural to ask, is that because of those norms? Or, it could be that the cross-regional differences have some other reason that aren't necessarily the ones that you've explored so far.
Yeah. All great points. So I think there's been debate about why Saudi Arabia like higher than India when there's just so many more restrictive, or similar restrictive norms there too. Also, why is Bangladesh so much higher than India when we're neighbors and have similar norms? And I think that this is less studied, and there's still a lot more puzzling things to uncover here. And I have some thoughts, but I don't want to, none of this is really scientifically valid or proven right now. But I think generally on your point of just whether within country differences, we do another study in West Bengal. So this study was done in Mumbai. My co-author and I have another study in West Bengal where we do a similar experiment, but there we're trying to understand flexibility in terms of timings for preference for work from home in these local offices, as well as childcare facilities versus not. And we find very similar take-up results and things. So it kind of really validates and reinforces many of these results here. And we find similar influence of norms even in that context. So they're quite similar in terms of overall rates.
Great. Then we are done with this session and we will rejoin at 11 o'clock on the dot.